So I recently lost some bees due to robbing. They've been robbing all year, couldn't really get a handle on it. The robbing bees went to low level robbing. It's really hard to spot. Occasionally you'll see it, but they really went through my reserves. So I reached a point where I had to actually do a feed for my bees. And I was just going to quickly run through what I actually use in terms of feeding the bees themselves. A lot of people are probably going to not be happy about this, but I do use honey in mine, and I have two versions. So I have one made with honey, ice and sugar. This is Whitworth's. If you're in the UK, you probably know this. Tate and Lyle is the other one, and Silver Spoon. Silver Spoon base theirs, from the information I got, they base theirs on beet sugar. Whitworth's and Tate and Lyle, I believe, are both cane. The kind of information I found online, how accurate it is, I'm not entirely sure, seemed to suggest that beet sugar was best avoided for bees. So I'd probably recommend Whitworth's or Tate and Lyle, and both of which I've used. When it comes to what I use is icing sugar. I'm making a dry feed, or a dry-ish feed. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, I use icing sugar. You need to get fondant icing sugar. You don't want to get any other kind, so you don't want to get royal, which has all kinds of additives in. The bog standard one, the same, has additives around anti-caking agents, things like that, of no use whatsoever to the bees. In fact, could be harmful to them. This has only two ingredients in it, so icing sugar, which is basically crushed granulated sugar, so sucrose, so glucose and fructose as a disaccharide, and then dried glucose syrup, so that's a monosaccharide in there. The dried glucose syrup, of course, is going to be directly usable by the bees, and once they've broken down the sucrose into fructose and glucose, similarly usable by the bees as well. So you just get all that in there. And what I'm going to make is I'm going to make one with the icing sugar and the Ultra Bee in. The Ultra Bee is just a protein supplement, so it just gives the bees that added extra protein there. So that's all in there now. I've got one that I made the other day. So this was off 2 boxes of icing sugar. It's been in the fridge for a while, so it tends to become quite hard, but that's what it looks like. Compared to a syrup, it's much more pleasant to handle. It's really quite nice, actually. And you can kind of see it's solid. If you leave it for a good while to come to room temperature, what you will find that some of the syrup starts to come on the outside and starts to appear on the outside and kind of leach out. But that actually comes in really handy for the bees, because rather than having to work something that's completely solid, having to then go and dilute this with water and turn it into a syrup, it kind of does it itself. It's quite amazing stuff, really. This is icing sugar and honey only, so there's no protein in there whatsoever. Once it's been out of the fridge for a while, though, it does become a lot softer and a lot stickier as well. It's still pretty sticky as it is. So that's the icing sugar in. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the honey in here. This will probably take about 10 minutes to get what's left out of here in, but we'll give it a good go. As anyone can probably figure, there's 2 risks to doing this. The first is that honey being in this, it can lead to robbing. I feed this behind a robbing screen at all times. The second thing, of course, is you do need to make sure that your honey didn't come from a hive that's had any kind of disease problems at all. And you'd be amazed how little honey you actually need. What I have got is, this is one of my worry frames. One of my worry top frames, I should say. It's from a pallet, untreated, completely untreated, well, heat treated, so untreated chemically. And I'm just going to use this to get the honey out. This honey was on a promise to somebody, but after my bees started struggling, I did have to kind of use it for feed instead. Although a little bit goes such a long way, I might have some left in the other jar actually. And then all you do is just mix the honey in. You don't want to get your hands in this too early. Otherwise you'll end up with that thing like you always get with baking, which is where your hands have that extra layer of your baking product stuck to them, and then you're having to try and constantly get it off as much as you can. What I should have done, and didn't do, because I was making it like I made it the other day, so I was making it without the protein in. I should have added some of this and mixed it whilst the icing sugar was dry. But I'll just pop some of this in. The amount of this you put in is going to vary. Of course, in spring, you're going to be putting a lot more of this in. But at this time of year, I tend to put it in for two reasons tend to be useful. The bees will still be using protein, so they'll still need it, or it'll be useful in their diet at least. And the second thing is that it masks the smell of the honey, which is probably the more useful thing in terms of preventing robbing. It doesn't mean that the bees can't find it, but compared to a pure sugar honey mix, it definitely is a little bit more stealthy. At this point I'll just try and get my hands in there and just see if there's actually anything to get hold of honey wise. The honey may well have come to nothing in there actually. Oh no, there is. It's starting to come together, but whether there's enough honey in there to do it, I'm not sure yet. I suspect not. Try and use remnants of this. Okay, that's not going to work. I'm going to have to leave that for a bit longer. My honey that was on a promise is probably going to get used then, I suspect. Oh man. As anyone will know, a tablespoon of this stuff that gets anywhere where it shouldn't is just a nightmare. So you just mix it in, and all you're looking for is, you're looking for stuff to start to stick together, but you'll know if you put too much in, if it forms a massive lump straight away, you've put far too much in there. It's a similar thing, I suppose, to baking itself, which is where you're looking for that kind of crumbly look that you're then going to bring together. This is coming together a little bit better than the last one. Now, honey being hydrophilic, it will actually draw moisture out of the atmosphere, and I'm not sure whether that's something that actually happens whilst you're doing this, because it's amazing how a little amount of honey will bring together quite a lot of very dry product. but it's a completely different process to the non-pollen, the non-mega bee one. You need a lot less honey to bring together just pure ice and sugar, but once you put the mega bee in, it does make it a lot drier. This has an advantage on the other side, of course, in that when you put it in the hive it will tend to stay drier and not leach out the honey as much. It's definitely starting to go though. I might not have needed that actually, patience might have been the key. I get the feeling patience might have been the key on this one actually. But you're looking for something similar to a pastry is what you'll end up with, something that Paul Hollywood would be proud of. But like pastries, it's really easy to over egg it, take it too far. So we'll probably get in there actually. Okay, I would say we're definitely there now. It shouldn't need any more honey, it's just a case of working what's already in there back in to the dry products. Or the dry products, I should say. And in the UK, using a wet syrup is fine, but in the northwest here it's so damp, so humid all the time. The last thing I want to do is be introducing any more liquid into the hive. The bees will have no problem finding water at any, well, you usually have no problem finding water at any time of year around here. But especially so in winter, they'll have no problem finding water to use. This is the strangest phenomenon. As you go on, it's really, really dry products that you had in here. It suddenly all changes. Everything starts to stick together and you do end up with a dough. It almost seems like it's not going to happen, and it's really easy to stick too much honey in, and then you'll just end up with a complete mess. you manipulate it, the more well, the happier it will be to accept more dry products as well. I'm going to take that out and try and work this one a bit more. That is quite a crumbly dough, I've got to be honest. A bit more crumbly than normal. And as you might have expected, all you're going to do now is just knead it. Hopefully it should come together. There's places where it has and there's places where it's still a bit crumbly. The bees won't complain about it being crumbly, though it gives them greater access to it. And have that. And the key with this is just patience, because the honey in there will absorb moisture out of the atmosphere and it will become easier to work with. One thing you don't want to do is make it too sticky, put too much honey in here, which just makes it really unpleasant to work with. That's actually pretty good. Like I say, patience is the key with this one. What's happening now is the honey starting to kind of make its presence felt. Yeah, it's becoming rather sticky now. So if anything, that probably needs some more dry material. And that's the key. If you go in with too much honey early on, you regret it later, because you end up with something that's unbelievably sticky. It never feels like it's going to do it, but it always does. what's amazing is the honey will absorb massive amounts of icing sugar. From this point onwards, you can keep adding it in. I'm kind of happy with that, to be honest. So what you can do with that then, put it in a bag, store it in the freezer, not freezer, well you probably can store it in the freezer. I tend to store it in the fridge, store it in the fridge until needed. And then when you get it, you'll have something equivalent to this. Or I could just feed this to the bees as is. Because of the way I keep my bees, mainly keep them in bait hives over winter, I actually have to do entrance feeding. It's not brilliant. The risk of robbing, of course, is always substantially increased because of that. Have to use a robbing guard to make sure that doesn't happen. And all you do is just break a piece off, and you can see how the actual structure of the icing sugar doesn't really change. The honey is more just a binder, and if you do leave this, the honey will come out of that. The honey will come out of binding it together, and you will get this kind of syrup that the bees find much easier to work than the solid block itself. But that's why I tend to store them in the fridge. It just stops all that liquid coming out of the kind of suspension matrix that the honey's in. And the second thing is, if I freeze it, I wouldn't be able to use it straight away, whereas those, you literally can take it out of the fridge, break a piece off, work it in your hand. After a couple of minutes or so, it's room temperature. Squish it between some non-stick paper, greaseproof paper. And then what I'll tend to do is just stick it in the entrance. I have 12 centimetre holes by a centimetre, so I probably wouldn't actually take out that much, to be honest. So a couple of weeks ago, I made some, what are they? Pollen patties? Not pollen patties, are they? It's bee food, not bee food. Fondant. So a couple of weeks ago I made some fondant. Made two different types. I made one with just icing sugar mixed with honey, and one with icing sugar mixed with honey, then with pollen as well. Both had different uses. The icing sugar I've been using over the last couple of weeks, a palm size piece. I've got frames which are attached to the top of the hive, so I can't open this until such time as I actually come to move them into their new home, which is either going to be a warray or a layers hive, possibly the layers. But yeah, so I can't open it yet until I actually come to do the transfer. So I'm having to kind of feed them through the entrance. It's not ideal. Of course, you'd rather feed internally, but if you can't, then you know you're kind of out of options a little bit, really. And what I've been doing with that is I've been feeding them this one, which is the icing sugar only one. You can see it's just come out of the fridge, and it's pretty malleable, so you can move that quite well. You can break pieces off. It's quite easy for me to work with when it's cold, and it's also quite easy for the bees to work with when it's cold as well. The other one is a pollen-based one. This will be used in the spring, and so I did make it a little bit early. This one is a completely different prospect. So because of the extra pollen in there, it's a lot harder, and I literally cannot move that at all. But the advantage is that this one I would stop using when things get warm, and this one you can continue to use and put in the hive throughout the spring, really. There are a couple of things just to talk about though in relation to each. When producing food, there are a couple of things that beekeepers may do that I avoided completely. And so one of them was I didn't heat the sugar in any way. The sugar I used almost certainly will have a degree of HMF in there. I know how it's produced. It is heated. It's how they produce things like molasses and various other things in there. So the idea that there's no HMF in there will be naive at best. But what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to compound that by increasing the amounts of HMF, which of course is poisonous to bees. And two things that do that, well, there's three things that do it. Time is one, so if you produce a liquid feed and leave it on the side for a long period of time, then HMF is going to be produced over time. Fingers crossed, the fact that they're a solid-ish food and they're in the fridge, hopefully that limits the production of HMF. The second thing, of course, is adding vinegar. So adding any acid, and that's going to hydrolyze the sucrose, it's going to break it apart. When it does so, it's going to release HMF. And the last thing is heating it as well. If you put it on a low heat, I believe you can avoid the production of too much of it. But if you're going to boil it to create a really thick syrup, then of course that may well lead to production of HMF as well. So I do everything I can to avoid producing that through anything I do, even though I do appreciate that there probably is HMF in there already. Like I say, it is front feeding, which is not ideal. If they were in a warate, then of course I'd just put an eek at the top and just stand that on there. I'd just put that in at the beginning of the winter, stand it on there, and they're just free to go at it all year. Because they're in a bait hive, I am limited by my options. They may well be alright, but I'm feeding them because I really just want to get them through to next year. They're going to be transferred at that point, so their current situation, it isn't completely irrelevant, but it's just about getting them to where I need them to be so that I can do something with them next year. And like I say, either Warray or the Layens hive. If you've not seen the Layens hive, it's how do you describe it? It's just a square top bat hive in essence. I'll just go and grab a frame. You can have a look at them because the frames are quite impressive. So one of the reasons why I keep Warray and Layens hives is the advantage of just being able to make all your woodenware yourself. The Warray are just square boxes, 30 centimetres by 30 centimetres internal dimensions. One of your piece of wood is going to be 30 and the other one I think usually about 34 if you're using 3/4 of an inch, something like that. So it makes 30 by 30 inside. You just route out but two edges, and then you make frames. The Warray frames are not massively different actually to these, and they're just shorter. They're about 31 centimetres long. The depth of the Warray is usually about 22 centimetres. So I usually have two arms on the Warrays going down. Yeah, probably about that far. And it just gives the bees more purchase because the bees can then stick their comb to the top, but also the sides as well. And of course you get that kind of hanging appearance in the Warray. This is a Layens frame. You could, if you were brave, replicate what you do in the Warray. So you could just use your top piece and two side pieces. I found that to be very, very unwieldy, and there was no real strength in the frame at all. So all I did was I just hammered on a base on there as well, and actually everything is a lot more rigid and absolutely perfect. I'm looking forward to getting started on these this year. But that's the actual size. So one of these filled with honey, of course, is going to weigh an absolute ton. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but we'll see. We'll see how they do. They should be strong enough, but there'll be a fair amount of weight in that when that's full of honey. One of the advantages that I can see though is if you've got two of these completely full of honey, back to back with bees in the centre, I couldn't imagine that they'd necessarily have to find any more frames to work on, because that may well actually do them fine. The other advantage is that in the UK we don't tend to have winters where they don't get at least a couple of days where they can actually transfer positions. So I'm looking forward to getting started on those this year. say, one of the advantages though of both of those two hives is that you can actually make everything yourself. And the frames is probably one of the more complicated things. They're very, very different, and you might have noticed that that layings is actually a little bit different to how usually it would be done. So usually what you would do is you would have very thick top pieces, very similar to a top bar hive, where all the top pieces would kind of nestle next to each other. It would then have the side pieces going down to the base. What I've done is I've actually replicated the kind of idea of the worry hive, so it's more like a hybrid, I suppose, a hybrid layings. And what I'm going to do is just put my frames in the top, and I'll use exactly the same principle I'd use as would be found in a worry hive. And I will use Hessian matting with a protective fiberglass base, and it's just a fiberglass mesh. It just stops the bees just basically tearing apart all the Hessian matting. Although maybe I might just stick the Hessian matting straight on. I'm not totally sure as yet. I know that if you're looking at the quilt, so on a worry hive, if you're looking at the quilt where you put the sawdust on top of the Hessian, you don't want that to be unprotected, because the bees will just chew through it and release sawdust all into the hive. So it may be that the Hessian's fine. It may be that I actually do use a fiberglass, a very thin fiberglass mesh, just to protect the Hessian, and then put that on top, and that will create a kind of faux roof for them on top of the actual frames. It'll limit air movement as well, so it will be almost like the frames are stuck to the ceiling for the bees, which hopefully should be reassuring for them. But I just thought I'd just quickly talk about these. It was just a quick update on why I didn't heat them, add vinegar or anything else as well. The reason why I use solids is I'm in the UK, northwest UK, great for cotton. It rained here for about, must have been 2 months, literally 2.5 months. We didn't have a single day without rain. I don't want to be feeding a liquid feed during that time. It's just so unnecessary to add any kind of moisture into the hive. It changes as soon as we hit December. It does change, and if I was tempted to use a liquid feed from this point onwards, I may well use it. But for late September, October, November, it's just a complete no-go. It literally rains non-stop every day virtually. I think we must have had like a handful. I would be surprised if it even reached double figures, the number of days we had over 2.5 months where it didn't rain at least once. And once it rains here, it tends to stay damp as well. So I really didn't want to be introducing any form of liquid into the hive, which then is going to ramp up the humidity at completely the wrong time of year. I know bees need it to be humid, and I accept that. That's why it's not a completely dry feed either, because I have seen it where people have opened up hives, they've chucked a bag of granulated sugar in there, and lo and behold, there's still granulated sugar left. I'm not surprised. I mean, if I was a bee, I'd kind of look at granulated sugar and go, thanks. That's really hard to work with, and I'd really rather not. Thank you very much. But people do use it. It's the ultimate solution to making sure you're adding no liquid into the hive as well, because you're definitely not doing that. But unfortunately, in that case, the bees have got to find liquid from somewhere so that they can actually use that granulated sugar. With this, the bees actually do work with it straight away. When I was making it, I think I explained that what it is I do use some of my old honey here, and what that does is it actually goes, because that's super saturated already, so that's not gonna dissolve any more sugar into it, or if it does, it's going to be very little. So what it does, it just acts as a binder, so it just binds the molecules, not the molecules, it binds the sugar particles together to form that kind of fondant-like texture. But when you put it out, the first thing the bees do is they're at it with their tongues, so there is some liquid that they're able to extract from it straight away. With the pollen one, when they work it, you can see it is definitely more of a solid. You'll find that there are bits that are left at the bottom of my robin screen. Not a lot, but you can tell it's definitely more solid. When they work the sugar one, you tend to find there's nothing left. And over time, it tends to liquefy as well, and that's probably down to the bees. But it does tend to do it naturally as well. If you leave it out at room temperature, it will start to liquefy. The honey probably does start to dissolve the icing sugar, and it does become more of a liquid. So and that's one of the reasons why I'd use the pollen one at a slightly higher temperature as well, because the icing sugar one just tends to turn into a gloop during the summer months. But that's why I do what I do, and why I'm kind of trying to do something between a solid and a liquid is that's my kind of rationale. I don't want it to be too hard for the bees to use, hence why I don't use completely solid granulated sugar, and I don't want it to be too liquid, increasing humidity levels to a point where it's just stupid, because all you need is just one really cold night and all that humidity is just going to condense in the hive. And with the way my hive is as well, it's almost certainly going to condense either on the comb at the top, which is more than likely where the bees are going to be, so on the comb and on the bees at the top of the hive, unfortunately. But that's just a quick update there. What I'm going to do for the next couple of videos, I'll actually do some videos on how to make the lay-ins, the worry hive, explanations of those, and how to make frames as well. I have managed to get a method where I can actually create frames using just purely circular saw and a couple of different jigs. So I'll quickly talk through that. It's a really, really easy and cheap way to get into beekeeping. You often hear the kind of couple of hundreds of pounds needed to actually get into beekeeping, but that just isn't true. There's nowhere near that. If you can get access to pallets, then you can limit your greatest cost, which is wood. You can limit that down almost to zero. Your electricity costs for power tools probably run into, if you leave a power tool running for about an hour, it's usually about, in the UK at least, it's usually between 12 to 15p. So those costs are fairly negligible. And everything else is really just your consumables, so your nails and your screws. If you decide to use recircular screws like I do, then that tends to be one of your greatest expenses, but they do hold my hives together for a long, long time. But I'll upload those videos as well, though, in the future. Okay, thank you. Bye bye.